Hi, this is Anamika, and this video is all about the French Revolution. In 1789, the French people rose an armed revolt against the king and overthrew the French monarchy and established a republic in the country. This event is known as French Revolution. The factors which were chiefly responsible for the miserable conditions that was prevalent in France and were the autocratic monarchy as well as the extreme social inequality. In the 16th century, France was ruled by Bourbon dynasty. The famous king were the Louis XIV, 15 and 16. These were the king who were very much fascinated for the wars. And the French rulers held that power of monarchs that were unlimited, and they had this firm conviction that the rulers had the divine right to rule his country as he wished. They also conducted all the matters of the country by making the laws and imposing taxes, declarations of war as per their wishes. They shows their favors to the higher classes but utterly neglected the welfare of the common people. In such conditions, the miseries and the suffering of the peoples went on increasing and their loyalty to the king began to decline. This is the picture of Louis XIV and then 15 and the Louis XVI, as well as here we can also see Napoleon Bonaparte, and during their regimes the France was looked like this. This is the image of the Queen Marie Antoinette, who was an Austrian princess, and she was married to the King Louis XVI. As she was the princess, she used to feel like this not to get mixed with the French common people, and she always used to tell the king not to get mixed and follow the same policy with the French common people. Her famous statement that she delivered at the time of the revolt, when the French were starving of the bread because of the severe winter and the failed crops, and when these peoples approached to Marie Antoinette, she told, let them feed the cake if they are starving. This is the image of the Palace of Versailles where the Bourbon dynasty was residing, and you can see the richness they used to avail and enjoyed, while the other peoples of France, they were starving. Now we will talk about that everything that was right. Then what was the cause which held the revolution in France? Here we will talk about the manifestations of the social surrounding or the social inequality. The social inequality in France had greatly increased by the later half of the 18th century. The French society was divided into three classes. The first consisted of high authorities of the church, the second of nobility, and the third of the common peoples. These common peoples were the gatherations of the traders, professionals, peasants, and the factory workers. The first state or the priestly state own a vast property. They constituted, however, only the 4% of the total populations, but owned nearly 80% of the land of the country. Moreover, in administrations, all the posts of the responsibility and the power were monopolized by them. They also enjoyed the innumerable privileges. In short, the two higher classes live a life of luxury and indulgence. The common peoples belonging to the third category were forced to bear the heavy burden of the taxations that we will talk about later. The next cause was the tax system of France, which widened the economic gulf, and that was created by the system that was in fashion in those eras in France. Actually, the first two of the states, they were not supposed to give any kind of taxes to the king, while the heavy burden of the taxes that was imposed only on the third state. This was the era when France was busy in the American War and the Seven-Year Wars. And the king was in the urgent need of money. To cope up with its need, he announced that the more tax would be introduced. This time the France was going beneath the severe winter, and the conditions of the urban poor peoples, that was also very much critical. And such announcement that was made by the king created kind of panic situations among them. Now we'll talk about the bourgeoisies or the middle class. These were the sections of the society which were the consequence of the industrial revolutions that was going on during those days in Europe. And we will also talk about the era of enlightenment. Some of the political awakenings was brought by these bourgeoisies and the thinkers. Some of the French philosophers began severely criticize the political and the social evil in the country. Montesquieu was a staunch opponent of the absolute monarchy. He advocated a theory of separations of power, that is, of legislative, executive, and judicial component of the government machinery. Voltaire, the famous philosopher, in his writing condemned the life of the indulgence of the higher class. The other important thinker, Rousseau, expounded the theory of the people's sovereignty. In his well-known book, which had this title of The Social Contract, he asserted that man is born free. To ensure a beneficious social order, the peoples voluntarily imposed upon themselves certain restrictions and create the governmental machinery for their implementations. Hence, the people are sovereigns and not the rulers. And as such, peoples have this equal right to overthrow the despotic rulers. Such thoughts propagated philosophers like Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. They embodied the declarations of independence and inspired the French Revolution. To cope up the war expenses, Louis XVI wanted to collect the taxes. And here we will talk about the States General. What was the States General? The States General was a political body to which 3 states sent their representatives, and the king alone was to be decided when to call the meeting. The last meeting that was held in 1614, and the second meetings which the Louis XVI was holding, that was after 175 years. On May 5th, 1789, Louis XVI called together an assembly of the States General to pass proposal for the new taxes. A hall of Versailles was prepared to host the delegates. The first and the second state sent 300 representatives each, who were seated in a row facing each other on 2 sides, while the 600 members of the third state had to stand at the back. The third state was represented by its more prosperous and educated members. Peasants, artisans, women were denied to entry in the assembly. However, their grievances and demands were listed, and you'd be amazed to know that about 40,000 letters which the representatives has brought with them.
The voting in the State General in the past had been conducted according to the principles that each state has one vote. This time too, Louis XVI was determined to continue the same practice. But the member of the third state demanded that the voting now be conducted by assembly as a whole, where each members would have one vote. This was one of the democratic principles, and that was put by philosophers like Rousseau in his book The Social Contract. The representative of the third state viewed themselves as a spokesman for the whole French nations. On 20th June, they assembled in the hall of an indoor tennis court in the ground of Versailles. They declared themselves a national assembly and swore not to disperse till they have drafted a constitution for France and that would limit the power of the monarch. They were led by Mirabeau and Abbé Sieyès. The Mirabeau was born in a noble family but was convinced of the need to do away with the society of the feudal privilege. He brought out a general and delivered a powerful speech to the crowd assembled in Versailles. Riots broke out in France. After the tennis court oath, the France ceded with the turmoil. A severe winter and the meant of the bad harvest, there was a price hike of bread, and after spending long hours in a queue at the bakery shop, the crowd of the angry women stormed into the shops. At the same time, the king ordered the troops to move into Paris. On 14th July, the agitated crowd stormed and destroyed the Bastilles. The fall of Bastille we will talk about later. Now, what had happened to the feudal of France? The feudal of France was termed as manor. There was a rumor among the villagers that the manors had sent troops to destroy the ripe crops. Caught in a frenzy of fears, the peasants of the several districts attacked on these feudal lords. They looted the grains and burned down the documents containing the record of the manorial dues. A large number of the nobles fled from their homes and many of them migrated to the neighbor country. These migrated noblemen were known as immigrants. One could see the changes that was going on in France. And now we will talk about the salon culture. What was the salon? The salon were the meeting place of the intellectuals and the middle class of France. There they used to meet and they used to discuss about the political happenings of those days of France. Faced by the revolters, Louis XVI finally accorded the recognitions to the National Assembly and accepted the principles that his power would form now to be checked by the constitutions. On the night of 4th August 1789, the Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal systems of the obligations and taxes. Members of the clergy too were forced to give up their privileges. Title was abolished and land owned by the church were confiscated. As a result, the government acquired assets worth of 2 billion livres. This was all happening on the basis of the proclamations, man are born free and equal in right. The National Assembly completed a draft of the constitutions in 1791. The main object was to limit the power of the monarch. This power, instead of being concentrated in the hand of one person, were now separated and assigned to the different institutions, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. This made the France a constitutional monarchy. The constitutions of 1791 vested the power to make the law in which the National Assembly, which was indirectly elected. This is the citizen voted for the group of the electors, who is in turn choose the assembly. Only the men of 25 years of age who could pay the taxes were allowed to vote. The remaining men, or we can say the slave, and all the women were classed as a passive citizens. That means they were not supposed to cast the vote. The constitutions began with the declarations of the right of the man and citizens, the right such as the right to live, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, equality before law, and were established as a natural and inalienable right, and that belongs to each human being by birth and could not be taken away. This was the duty of the state to protect the citizens' natural rights.
Now we will talk about the absolute monarchy turned into the constitutional monarchy, and that all happened with the fall of Fort Bastille. Why Bastille? Bastille was a fort come a prisoners, and it also denoted the despotic power of the king. This is an image of the fall of Bastille. In between somewhere, when the France was going through the turmoil, the several hundred men marched toward the eastern part of France, where the Bastille fort was, and they killed the commander and set the 7 prisoners free. Actually, there was a rumor that the king has put the arm and armament into the fort of Bastilles. Their aim was to seize all these. The situation in France continued to be tense during the following years. Now we will talk about the Guillotine or the Guillotine and the La Marseillaise or the national anthem of France. What was Guillotine or Guillotine? It was a weapons that used to kill the peoples who used to talk against these revolutionaries. That was invented by Dr. Guillotine, and its name got from his name. The La Marseillaise was the national anthem of France, and it was composed by poet Rosette de l'Isles, and it was sung from the first time from the people of Marseilles. That is why it is known as Marseillaise. The Marseillaise is now a national anthem of France. These are the images of guillotine or guillotine, and this is the doctor who invented this weapon. These are the images of National Assembly and the national anthem of ancient France. The transactions of the political arena in France. The large section of the populations were convinced that the revolutions has to be carried further, and the Constitution of 1791 gave the political right only to the richer section of the society. So many political groups that were emerging, and here we will talk about the political club. What was this political club? The political club was the area where the important rallying point for the peoples who wished to discuss the government's politics and the plans, their own form of actions. The most successful of these clubs was the Jacobins, and which got its name from the former convent of Saint Jacobs in Paris. Here, one thing we will talk about also, that was the organizations that was formed by the women of France. So, 1790, the France witnessed the emergence of the 3 major clubs. The first was the Jacobins. They were also known as the Radical Revolutionary. Second was the Girondins or the Liberal. And the third one was the Society of the Revolutionary Republican of Women. Among all these 3 clubs, the major emergence the Francis saw was the emergence of the Jacobins Club. The Jacobins Club belongs mainly to the less prosperous sections of the society. They included all the lower strata of the society, and the leaders of this Jacobins Club was Maximilian Robespierre. Here we can see the image of Maximilian Robespierre. A large group among the Jacobins decided to start a new revolutionary movement that we will talk about later. This is the image of sans-culottes, the sans-culottes and the breeches of the sans-culottes of Jacobin clubs. Now, who were these sans-culottes? The sans-culottes were the people who were the member of Jacobins club. They were the common peoples, and they had this firm belief that the power is being consolidated by the rich Francisci. A large group among the Jacobin clubs, they started wearing a long striped trousers similar to those worn by the dock workers. This was to set themselves apart from the fashionable section of the society, especially nobles who wear the knee breeches. It was the way of proclaiming the end of the power widens by the wearer of the knee breeches. The Jacobins came to be known as the sans-culottes, literally means those without the knee breeches. The sans-culottes men wore, in addition, the red cap that symbolizes the liberty. And the women were not allowed to do like this. The revolt that France faced from 1789 till 1792. Actually, this was the time of starvation, and the rumor spread that while the people are starving, the king is having party in the Versailles palace. So the group of the women, they marched toward the Versailles and they imprisoned the royal family. During the late 1792, the radicals attacked the Louis family. The monarchy was suspended. The Legislative Assembly was also suspended. A new constitution was to be made and the election was announced. In the election, the men of 21 years of age who were the owner of a certain assets were allowed to vote, while the woman and the slave, they were not allowed to cast their vote, and they were known as the passive citizen. 1791, the strategy for the escape and the reaction from the other part of the Europe. Now something very interesting had happened here. Within all this turmoil, the King Louis planned to escape, to run away from France with his wife. While he was running out, the Louis and his wife were caught by the angry mobs. These mobs were so much angry as they were hoping that King himself was ready to give the authority of France in their hand. But here, the escape of the king proved that the king was not in that mood. Now the people forced the king for the written constitutions. The written constitutions in those days the Britain was having, and they asked the same. They asked the Louis to be the monarch only for the namesake. The Louis was in double mind and quickly took an action to suppress the revolt against them. For that, he asked the friendly support from Austria and other neighboring countries. He also ordered his national army to attack on the mob. While the other part of the European country, they were so much terrified, whatever that was happening in the France, and they want, as they don't want to slip this this monarchy from their hand, they were quite alert. That was a lesson the France was given to them. The National Convention, September 1792 to October 1795. Now France was all set for the third government era. The elections that was decided by the suffrage, and the age was fixed for 21 years of age of all men who were rich. The monarchy was abolished. The introduction of republican that was done. The Committee of Public Security. Now what was this Committee of Public Security? The Public Security was a committee that was small in size though, which used to take control of all the political activity of France. Now the France was under the rule of terror, that was under the Jacobins Club. Why it was known as the rule of terror? The Jacobins has tendency to seize the enemy on the suspect basis, and for this they killed around 16,000 enemy, and they killed it by the weapons known as guillotine that we had talked about. Marie Antoinette, she was also guillotined. The church was destroyed, and the property of the church was confiscated. Naturally, the Pope was quite angry. The slavery abolished. The new calendar that was launched, though that was totally being banned and abolished by the time of the Napoleon that we will talk about later. Finally, the peoples were so much annoyed of the killing of the peoples that they wanted to abolish this regime of terror, and for that they seized Robespierre, they imprisoned him and sent him for guillotine. With the killing of Robespierre, the regime of terror that was end. Some of the important dates that we discussed so far: 1789, that was the formation of State General. 1789 to 91, National Assembly. 1791 to 92, Legislative Assembly. 1792 to 95, National Convention or the Regime of Terror. And 1799, the Coup D by Napoleon Bonaparte. The Directory, 1795 to 1999. The France now face the emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte. The fall of Jacobin clubs allowed the wealthier middle class to seize the power. The new constitution was introduced, which denied the vote to the non-propertied section of the society. These then appointed a directory and executive made of the 5 members. The political instability of the directory paved the way for the rise of the military dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. The regime of Napoleon and the Consulate, 1799 to 1804. 30 years of age of Napoleon was the man who revolted against the directory rule and established the Consulate. Now, what was the Consulate? The Consulate was an administrative body that was made by Napoleon himself to run and to take care of all the administrative activity that was held in France during his regime. He established a body known as Consul. This body of Consul, it comprises 3 of the members. The Napoleon himself became the first Consul. In 1804, Napoleon declared himself as the Emperor of France. As soon as he declared himself as the Emperor of France, he started conquering the neighboring part of France, and wherever he won and conquered and got victory, he established his family member as the ruler of those parts. At first, the Napoleon was taken as a liberator who could bring the freedom of the people, but people soon realized that the temperament of Napoleon was nothing but as a despotic, and Napoleon was finally defeated in the War of Waterloo in 1815. But the contributions of Napoleon cannot be denied, as Napoleon introduced many of the policies for the welfare of the people, such as the protection of the private property, second, the uniform system of weight and measure, and third, the most important was the decimal system. France aftermath. We are moving toward the conclusion. With Napoleon, the absolute monarchy was replaced by the military dictatorship. The second phase was quite remarkable and quite interesting, as after the death of Napoleon, the King Louis XVII, he was crowned as the new King of France. The church was restored, but the positions of the layman and the woman that remained the same. Here, it won't be denied to talk about that the French revolutions that was started with the abolition of the monarchy and ended up with the monarchy itself. Now we will talk about the legacy. Did French Revolution mark by any legacy? The answer is the four of the contributions we can seek from the French Revolution. The French Revolution gave the constitution's monarchy. Second, it abolished the feudalism. Third, it gave the idea of the right of the man, the laws of the liberty, equality, and fraternity. And last, that was the nationalism spread enough throughout the Europe after the French revolutions. Thank you.